Today, we keep on talking about how to develop adaptive card extensions with the SharePoint framework. And specifically today, we will cover how we can manage state and properties while developing ACEs with SPFx. So, like always, few words about the topic by itself with the help of a few slides, and then I will move to some demos. So whenever we create adaptive card extensions for Microsoft Viva connections in SharePoint framework, we can manage properties and state like we can do with whatever kind of React component. And specifically, we can manage the properties either using a property pane, a configurable property pane, like we do for web parts, or we can manage properties values via code. As well as we can manage the state of the component in code. Whenever we define an adaptive card extension, we can declare the interfaces defining the layout of both the properties interface and of the state interface, which will be managed inside the adaptive card extension, but which will also become available in all of the CardViews and QuickViews related to the adaptive card extension in which we are. Just as a reminder, whenever you create an adaptive card extension, the UI is based on two different flavors of cards. There are the CardViews and the QuickViews. The CardViews are really simple, and you can have a look to the previous demo we did a couple of weeks ago. And the QuickViews are more complex based on adaptive card JSON. Regardless of the flavor of card you want to create inside an adaptive card extension, you can always manage and get access to the properties and state defined in the extension type declaring the adaptive card extension. And once you have the state and properties in your card, you can then use those objects and the properties of those objects as the source for data binding, for example, in the UI, as we will see in one of the upcoming demos in the upcoming SIG calls, as well as you can provide custom logic inside your cards based on the state and the properties of the adaptive card extension component. So that said, let me move to the demo environment and let's see how we can play with state and properties in ACEs. And first of all, I'm going to show you a fresh new adaptive card extension that I just created using the YOMAR generator for SharePoint framework, because I want to highlight you some excerpts of code. So for example, whenever we generate an adaptive card extension, we know that we have the adaptive card extension type, and in the declaration, in the definition of the type, we extend the base adaptive card extension, including an interface definition for the properties and one for the state. As you can notice here, those two interfaces are defined with the export keyword, and inside these interfaces, we simply define the properties that we want to have to configure the adaptive card extension and the state that we want to use to manage the current state of the component. Talking about the properties, it is interesting to notice that the properties are manageable through the property pane, but in the design of the adaptive card extensions, the auto-generated code relies on the load property pane resources method in order to get the property pane structure from an external TypeScript file, like this one, for example, in which we can see we have the I would say, well-known structure that we use whenever we create a SharePoint framework web part, even if right here in the auto-generated code, we have an isolated file for the definition of the get property pane configuration method. But here, we can simply recognize all of the code that we are used to using whenever we create a SharePoint framework web part in order to manage the fields, to edit, to let the users edit the values of the properties. Like, for example, here, title, icon property, and description are the three pre-generated properties generated by the scaffolding tool, and those map to the properties that we have in the state. Then when we move to the CardViews and QuickViews, either generated by the scaffolding tool or manually created by ourselves, we can see that, for example, in the CardView, we get the definition of the import of those interfaces from the file defining and from the tab defining the adaptive card extension component, and that's why the state and properties are defined as exportable. And here we simply inherit from the base type, and we refer to the properties and state interfaces that we define in the extension file. As such, we can then use those interfaces as the type of the properties property of this object referring to the card view, as well as we can access with the same technique also the state. And for example, if we go to the quick view auto-generated for this project, we can see that we can, of course, still use the same logic. So we have the interface for the properties and for the state imported in this file and used in the definition of our quick view. And we can always say this dot properties or this dot state, and we can access the properties and state of the adaptive card extension. And this is really useful because when we do that, then we can use the properties and state as the content or to create the content that we want to data bind in the UI of our adaptive card extensions. Now I'm already running this project, so if I will quickly switch to the workbench, let me refresh this page. I hope the zoom is good enough. Here we have the really simple adaptive card extension just generated with the scaffolding tool, and we can see that we have the property pane I was talking about just a few seconds ago, which has been generated based on the fields that we've defined. And of course, you can create your own property pane and make your properties configurable. Now, talking about something a bit more deep or interesting about properties and state, I have another example that I want to share with you. So first of all, let me stop this one and let me switch to another example. Here we can see an adaptive card extension that I created just for the sake of explaining how specifically state and properties work in ACES. And here we have an adaptive card extension with a state with a time property of type string. In this adaptive card extension, in the onInit method, I simply rely on the set interval of JavaScript to invoke every second a function which will get the current time and will show the current time. So as you can imply from the name, and let me in the meantime start this project so that you can save some time, gulp serve no browser, okay. But this will be an adaptive card extension to show the current time. So really simple, just for the sake of explaining you something. Now, what is interesting to notice is that when we do that and when we have such an adaptive card extension and we set in the state of the component the current time, and we do that every second, then in the card view, we can rely on the state.time property here, as well as we can do the same in the quick view, and we can bind the current time in the UI of the quick view. Now, if I will go back to the workbench, and in the meantime, hopefully the project will be running, hopefully, but not yet. I don't see the reload warning or information here, but let me try still to refresh the page and see if we can already add it to the workbench. Let's see if I'm lucky. Come on, still working. What I want to show you is that based on the architecture of the adaptive card extensions and thinking about the fact, and now we are ready, we should be ready, and thinking about the scope and the idea behind the scene of building adaptive card extensions, when you create an adaptive card extension, the card view and the quick view of the adaptive card extension will be showed to the UI and to the user just once per time. So if I go here and I add my clock ace, we can see if I go to preview that we have the current time in my time zone right now. And if I click on the quick view, I will see the current time in the quick view. But as you can notice, the time will not be updated in the backing card view because the logic behind the scene of the adaptive card extension is keeping track of which is the component in foreground right now, and will keep the properties and the state up to date just for that one, just to save resources, which is a reasonable behavior if you think about that. But you need to be aware of this behavior when you work with this kind of properties and state in your adaptive card extension. One last thing that I want to share with you, and then I can give the screen back to Vesa or to Hugo actually, is that when you do that, when you define properties and state, and specifically now properties in your adaptive card extension, you can also, for example, think about using the properties in order to hold a reference to useful functions that you want to make available to the cards that you have in your adaptive card extension solution. So here, for example, this is a solution which we already saw in a previous SIG call, just as an overview, and we will dig into this one in one of the upcoming episodes. But right now, with this adaptive card extension, we can manage a list of orders through the Viva Connection UI. This is the mobile preview of the Viva Connection dashboard on my tenant. And for example, I can see a list of orders, and I can eventually edit orders, or I can add new orders to the list of orders that I can manage through this adaptive card extension. Well, what is interesting here is that in the properties, I also defined the functions to load, add, update, or delete orders, so that when I am in, for example, a quick view like this one, the add order quick view, I can always rely on these properties dot the name of the function that I want to use, and having defined the mapping between these properties and the actual implementation in my adaptive card extension, I can also create, in my opinion, a good way of managing your code base, having a centralized place like the adaptive card extension component where you define all of the functions. And then you can simply rely on those functions in all of the other cards and quick views that you have, simply relying on the function properties defined in the properties interface. And I think that's all for me for today. So back to you, Vesa, and thank you.
Awesome, Paolo. Thank you. Really, really great stuff and great demo on the concepts to understand how ACs can be implemented. The ACs, just to kind of a recap, I think Paolo said it many, many times, but just to recap for those who are still wondering what are those, but their intention on the adaptive card extensions for Viva Connection is that you're able to build your own company mobile portal. So you can design your mobile experience, which can be then extended. You can surface the company information for first-line workers who only have a mobile device, not necessarily sitting right next to desktop device all the time.